What's up, humans? Before I show you my conversation with Dr. John Blitch, I want to introduce you to one of the newest sponsors that are going to be part of Psicoactivo for the foreseeable future. One of these sponsors is author Edson Freeman, and he has a number of books that he has written that he wants to promote on the show. So I want to thank Edson for reaching out to me and for supporting the show. So I'm going to read you a couple of things, but the book is this one right here. It's the nonfiction book that he has. It's called Strange Light. It has opinions from Darren King, from Kelly Chase, and from Robin Lasseter. And this is the description right here. It says, the night after his wedding, a man walks out into the Texas desert. 1 a.m, alone in a clearing, flat on his back. He asks out loud to be taken. He wakes up hours later in bed, screaming. 3 figures at the corner of the bed, 7 feet tall, no faces. Manitoba, 1965. Children see something land in the field. 3 small figures get out and beckon to them. The kids run. Their father walks out and finds 3 smoldering circles in the grass. A parent, home alone with his grandchild, hears his adult son cry out. The phone rings 40 minutes later. He'd fallen from the ladder at work. He died at the minute of the scream. 3 of more than 20 accounts in a book called Strange Light by Edson Freeman. The question it's asking isn't whether to believe these people, it's what you learned if you did. Freeman's day job is in it. 30 years of working out why systems fail, but he isn't an investigator and he isn't building a case. He interviewed every person himself, let them talk, and had each of them check their own account for accuracy. Nobody in this book gets interrogated about how they can be sure. People tell you something different when they're not on trial. Blue Ink Review gave Strange Light a star review. Only about 5% of the books they see get one. Kelly Chase, host of Inquiry, says it isn't about proving anything, it's about listening. And Darren King, advisor of the John Mack Institute, calls the book, quote, as delightful as it is paradigm shattering, end quote. Strange Light by Edson Freeman, paperback, hardcover, and ebook. On Amazon, you can find it, and at edsonfreeman.com, or ask your local bookstore to order it. I want to thank author Edson Freeman for sponsoring this video on Psicoactivo. What's up, humans, and welcome to a new Psicoactivo. Happy Tuesday to everybody all around the world. I know a lot of people watch from Japan, I saw the other day, so thank you for being here. Today is a very special occasion because I have a returning guest, first time returning, who has been on the show and made a profound impact in a lot of people who have gone through similar experiences in early 2025, when he decided to come forward with the massive accolades that he has and the massive curriculum vitae that he has to speak about personal experiences that he went through. And this hasn't been seen very much in the past, somebody of his stature to come out and be vulnerable like that. And I really did appreciate that when it happened. So the first time that we spoke, we talked a lot about those experiences. I'm going to leave them in the description so you guys can check it out, that first conversation that we had. But my guest today is a PhD in philosophy, behavioral psychology, and neuroscience. And he is also a retired lieutenant colonel from the Army. I want you guys to please welcome Dr. John Blitch back to the show. How you doing, sir? Welcome to Psicoactivo.
Hi, Pablo. Thank you for having me back. This is a fascinating time, to say the least.
Yeah. Well, we should start, though, by speaking about the time I just reached out to you when you were in Washington, D.C. at the Disclosure Forum. People were taking pictures and you were in some of those pictures in the background. So I was like, oh, there's Dr. Blitch. So I decided to reach out. How was that experience like? Because it seems like it may have been a momentous occasion throughout the week because there were 2 events, very important ones. And I just want to get your sense of how that was like.
Yeah, so the Well, thanks for having me, and thanks for giving me a chance to grab a cup of Joe. This is my favorite coffee cup of
Cheers,
all
sir.
time. Do you see what that
Cheers.
says?
May bridges I burn like the way.
So,
Adding a little bit insult to injury right now, aren't you, doctor?
oh my gosh, I have a good friend of mine, one of my classmates from West Point, actually, who went into the FBI, and he sent me that cup. I think right after my interview with Ross Coulthard, geez, about a year and a half ago. And, I just want to address one thing about that is I did not have any intention going into that interview of talking about my own stuff. My whole reason for being there was to help Ross validate Jake Barber as who he was. And I was, I thought he might get into it. So I was rehearsing a little bit, what he might ask and so forth and so on. But it went kind of off the rails into that thing. And you could see his demeanor change, and he's made several points about it that he was a little bit worried about the impact on that on his career as well. So he took some risk getting into that subject area, but my scientific career is in the gutter as a
What do you
result of that.
mean?
But, well, we'll get into this in the disclosure form thing. So I'm going to mention that in terms of what Pip Amalgam said. But to me, that disclosure form event, it was wonderful. I was very honored to receive an invitation. I mean, nobody paid for my travel or anything, but it was wonderful to attend. I did not intend to be public at all. I was trying to kind of hide a little bit, not intentionally, just as old habits die hard. As a special ops guy, we just try to stay in the shadows and so forth as much as possible. But I would to capture the entire event in a phrase, I would say it was a few rays of sunshine in a gray cloud of continued obfuscation. I guess that's what I would claim. And I think a lot of us in the experiencer world are just sick and tired of being ignored. And
Yeah.
So there was very little discussion of crash retrievals or abductions and experiences, which many of us feel are the most important aspect of this whole thing. And if nothing else, I think it's the very basis for the secrecy, the continued secrecy. So the three rays of sunshine for me were, number one, when Kirk McConnell, during the national security panel with Chris Mellon and Tim Gallaudet, Merrick von Renkamp, all really impressive folks, and I adore all of them. I think they're all doing wonderful stuff, but they were just tap dancing around the experiencer side of things in all the discussion up to that point. And then Kirk said this, and you can go back and look at it on YouTube or download or whatever, at 2 hours and 32 minutes. This is what he said. And it was the context of, do we really need to keep these whistleblower protections going, or is there potential for them to be abused by people that just want to get even with their boss by claiming they were an abductee and they were being singled out for, punishment or whatever. And so he pushed back against that and said, and I think Chris had said something to the effect that, nobody had ever been thrown in jail for sharing classified information with Congress in the right environment. But then they both acknowledged, Chris acknowledged sort of begrudgingly at the very end of his statement that now, there's still administrative actions that the government can take, like, for example, taking your security clearance away. So there is that. So I guess we do need some sort of continued whistleblower protection. And then Kirk jumped on that and amplified it by saying that there is no way that the current whistleblower protections are adequate because those administrative actions of taking your security clearance, I mean, that your career is over. Dylan Borland suffered that. A
Matthew
lot of
Brown.
lot of folks have suffered that. Yeah. So this is what he said to augment that. He said, I would also say that as some people have brought up here today, the people who have encountered NHI beings, either by being abducted or via close encounters, they have a lot of information. Now, they've been marginalized and ridiculed for decades and decades, but they are a repository of knowledge about the nature of these beings and how they communicate, what they communicate, what they say they're here for, why they say they're behaving the way they do. So I think there's a great untapped potential in the private sector to pitch in and solve this problem. And so that was the first time at 2.5 hours when we really start talking about this. And I got to tell you, Pavel, I had a seat up front as being one of the invited folks. And then, they opened doors for everybody else to come in. But I was so bored with the continued, rehashing of the same old stuff. And I understand that the objective is to drag the folks who haven't been involved in this into the light, right? So I understand that, but it's boring as hell for those of us who've been around this, right? So I had gotten up and I was about to fall asleep. So I got up, stand up, the standard, behavior to keep from falling asleep. And I was off to the side. And I got to tell you, if I was still sitting there, I would have leapt to my feet and just jumped in applause. But I was off to the side. And I've got to say that was the loudest applause of that entire session right after he said that. And that's really important because I'm going to close all this in a second. Then Pippa Malmgren, 5 hours later, at 7 hours and 6 minutes, they're discussing, so she's a brilliant economist. A lot of people know. She's a good friend of mine and colleague. I think the world of her. And they were just discussing in the context of the influence on the markets of, revolutionary technologies like free energy and so forth and so on. And she was talking about in the context of maybe China's potential disclosure. What if they disclose before us, back and forth? Interesting issue, right? And she says, so we may have, this is at 7 hours and 6 minutes. Kirk's statement was at 2 hours and 32 minutes. So at 7 hours, 6 minutes, Pippa says, so we have our hangups. We may have our view that the US government has all the answers. But actually, I'm not so convinced. They may have a lot of data. They may have a lot of insight, but do they have answers? And well, maybe, but we actually already have a lot of answers in the general public. As was discussed in a previous session, I don't know if she was talking directly about Kirk's statement, but she said citizen scientists who just, the people who have had experience with these phenomena or this phenomena, I find it very interesting and strange that here in the United States, we have based our entire legal and justice system on the importance of the witness, except on this subject, in which case all the witnesses are crazy. And again, for that session, the loudest applause. And then finally, the third ray of sunshine was massive. And this was at 7 hours and 22 minutes into the event. Jordan Flowers presents the first ever disclosure grant to Dylan Borland, Matthew Brown, and Jeff Nusatelli. I'm starting up this Vanguard enterprise.
Yep.
And Matthew accepts the award and says a few words. And then before he even gets to the microphone, Dr. Science Bob McGuire stands up right in front. You can see it on the replay. And he stands up and he's clapping. And I'm expecting there's going to be this huge, standing ovation. But there's only like 2 or 3 people get up. So I'm off on the side. You can hear me at like 7 minutes, 20 or 7 hours, 22 minutes and around 50 seconds. I yell, get up, everybody up. I'm off the side. Finally, people start rising to their seats. And I was thinking, we've been sitting here. The blood has been pooling in our legs. You ought to welcome the opportunity to stand up. So anyway, Matthew very graciously accepts the award, and he makes the point of acknowledging the plight of experiencers and abductees and the suppression and how we've been marginalized, etc. And then he singles out Whitley Strieber, who's in the crowd. And then Whitley takes the podium to describe how difficult it is for us, because we're traumatized 3 times. One is by them, whoever they are. The second is when we tell our friends and family. And then the third is by society at large. And so
Telling the
Whitley,
world.
yeah, exactly. And so we're trying to be honest and courageous, and then we get slammed the 3rd time. So Whitley did a great job of describing that. He said, he described how difficult it was at the beginning. It's been a hard road for him. And then he said, at the beginning, he was talking about how he ended up staring into the face of a jeering host on a television set under the bright lights alone, and then going home that night and coming face to face with the very thing that the audience, was laughing at. But then he looked at us and he said, everybody in the audience, he said, but you're not laughing. And I'm glad you're here. Keep up the good work. We will become a cosmic species. And what a great way to end that entire event on an upswing. And this was after Dr. Janice Villauer and her team had briefed their study, where they made it very clear that as a panel of psychologists, they found no evidence that society at large was going to suffer any mental illness through disclosure of the existence of extraterrestrial life. And so the ending of this, it really ended up on an upswing. So I started out bored, disappointed, and I ended up feeling really good about things. So that's kind of my summation of the Disclosure Forum. And my hat is off to Jordan Flowers and Chris Mellon, everybody involved in that whole realm, Hunt Willis, Dylan Guthrie, all the folks in the Disclosure Forum for pulling that off. And it was really well done. And they also acknowledged some of the courage from a lot of members of Congress, right? Because they risked their career. They risked getting voted out of office for that. But again, that's on one side. On the other side, they get paid to accept risk on behalf of their constituents. Whereas, Matthew Brown and Dylan Boylan, Jeff Nuzzatelli, and all the other guys, Mario Woods and Jeff Goodrich and Terry Lovelace, all these folks, they are putting their lives on the line. A little bit different game, right? Because they know going in, they know before they start telling their stories that people have been killed in the past for sharing that stuff. So a little bit more risk in my perspective, and I talk about it in this book, that my definition of love is risk accepted on behalf of another human. And so I felt like there was an upwelling of love at the end of that event. So that's my rather drawn out summation of.
No. Thank you, sir. It was great to hear your perspective from it. You were also on the front, experiencing everything. So I didn't know who that scream was from. Now I know that it's you. That's funny.
Blame me. Throw the tomatoes at me.
So I guess there are like a couple of disconnects that I saw, specifically from what seems to be mixed sort of messaging between what Matthew Brown is trying to say with his writing, with the waivers and all that stuff, and people from the Disclosure Forum and other places that seem more official. Avi Loeb also released a video recently where he's like, okay, come forward. But it seems like they don't seem to understand that you can already do that, as Kirk McConnell well put, The concerns that I think Matthew Brown has is also about the of the books kind of retaliation that goes on. What do you think should happen for all the efforts in the disclosure movement to like be on the same page on that, because they seem to be like on different types of wavelengths, and it's kind of confusing for a lot of the lay people like myself, you know.
Yeah, my perspective is that we're sort of half pregnant right now. We are dribbling. People have talked about the slow drip, and my argument has been from the get-go that we got to rip the Band-Aid off. We need a Boston Tea Party. I've said that 3 years ago at an event with Lue Elizondo. And this is the thing about Lue Elizondo. I love him like the brother from a different mother during shared service, in Afghanistan and other places. And the thing is, brothers can disagree and still be brothers. Friends can still disagree and still be brothers. And Lou and I disagree on several things over the years, but we can still be friends. And that is a lesson that I would like to share with everybody. And there's this age-old question about, are we ready? Well, for crying out loud, you're never going to be ready. I wasn't ready to take robots to the World Trade Center. Never ready for the disaster, something of that magnitude. So again, I'm a fan of ripping the Band-Aid off. And I guess I would push back scientifically against those who continue to claim that society is not ready. Well, wait a minute. Just because you have piled higher and deeper credentials like me in astrophysics or aeronautics, you're out of your lane. You're not a behavioral scientist. You're not a psychologist like this guy.
Yeah.
Right?
Of course.
So for the government, or this guy, Don Dunbar, right? So these are psychologists, behavioral scientists. If a behavioral scientist tells me that society's not ready, okay, then maybe I'll give you the weight that you deserve. But just because you have a PhD in basket weaving does not mean you should be telling me how to handle my regulator when I'm scuba diving. That's an apples and oranges thing. And unfortunately, we are all stuck in our heads that an aerospace physicist is smarter than everybody in every field of endeavor. That's just not right. And I say that lovingly with my dad as an aerospace physicist before he passed. So I'm worried about that in that context. And I think that society is seeing through all that. And so the reason that I brought up those three rays of sunshine is all of those are I consider that to be very strong evidence for what Jake Barber shared with us in his one of his several interviews when he talked about, I don't think there's going to be an ontological shock. There is ontological relief. And so those standing ovations, those applauses that we saw in the Russell building, I consider that to be direct evidence that we are ready and that it will be an ontological relief.
Can I do a follow-up real quick? Because what if, and this is just a hypothetical, right? But there seems to be certain signs from people like Lue, from people like Karl Nell, who seems to be in some sort of a hurry as well. It feels to me like they may have a little more access to information that the rest of people within the movement don't have, because they're going in podcasts and in different places, sort of hinting that we don't have time, or I cannot talk about that. It's not my lane, but there might be something coming. And, I know that a behavioral scientist has to be the one who makes a proper assessment of whether we're ready or not, perhaps with some opinions from anthropologists as well, right? But it's important for me to try and understand whether these guys do have some kind of access to data that is compelling, and they're probably trying to ease it up into people, you know. I don't know if probably you haven't, but I don't know what your opinion on that is, of maybe that's a possibility that they do have data. Maybe they don't understand it too. Maybe it's a little bit, sparse data that they're trying to understand, but they see it as a potential threat. Potential, I said, What's your thought on that?
So several thoughts on that. Lots to unpack there, and that's due to your very insightful command of this whole subject. So my applause to you. First and foremost, I want to say that I am in agreement with Pippa and what she said, that, hey, look, the government may have more information just because they prevent the dissemination of it through classified sensors. Okay. But I've been over this several times, and I've shocked several of these guys, and I love them like brothers, Karl and Dave Grusch and Lue. And I'll just blurt something out, and they're like, well, how'd you know that? You've never been read in. I'm like, yeah, dude, I started in the Invisible College at West Point, and then individual graduate school while I was waiting for the Air Force to finally bring me on as a senior scientist with the Air Force Research Lab. So there is an enormous volume of open source literature that is out there that probably has more information than even the government. Half of the folks in the intelligence community haven't even dipped into that sufficiently to gain a large enough perspective. And the problem with that is, and I've said this many times before, that the intelligence community is inherently pessimistic. They have to be. They look at the world through threat-colored glasses, and you have to be. That is your job. I was an intelligence officer at the battalion level as a battalion S2, as a first lieutenant, back during the Cold War, and I really didn't like it because it was constantly pessimistic. I'm reading all of these daily reports coming in on teletype machines, all encrypted stuff. And it's constantly hammering about how the Soviet Union is this and that and the other thing. And, Reagan used that very effectively to fund SDI, the Star Wars program. And there is evidence that was dual function, not just to protect us from Soviet missiles, but to protect us from other stuff, maybe transients. I want to really unpack that, because I think that's probably another huge, brilliant ray of sunshine
From Beatriz.
Was Beatriz and Steve Bruehl getting together.
Yep.
And yep. I want to comment on that. That was just this last week at SCU conference. But anyway, so all that to say that the intelligence community has to be pessimistic. But that is not the big world. The big world is optimistic. There's a lot of good stuff that goes on outside the vault that Jay Stratton, Dave Grusch, Lue Elizondo, Karl Nell, and Chris Mellon, all those folks spent their lives in. So they are inherently pessimistic. The rest of us, like those of us who have seen our fellow humans put themselves at risk in Oklahoma City, the World Trade Center, Hurricane Katrina, I feel like I am better calibrated in the sense of seeing the good side of humanity. And so this threat narrative is a derivative of that expression. Like all of us, we are all the product of our experience. So if you live in a pessimistic, threat-based narrative, you're going to come to threat-based conclusions. So I want the world to expand beyond that. And I want my government to expand beyond that and hand over this issue from the Department of Defense and War. Look, DOD, you've had 80 years. It's time for the Department of State to take over. if there are, like many of us feel, that we are on the verge of becoming, like Whitley Strieber said, a cosmic species, then it doesn't make sense to lead with your weapons. You should be leading with your diplomats. And so I was ecstatic that Marco Rubio, who was a proponent for disclosure, became Secretary of State. And I was like, yes, it's going to happen anytime. Here we are, 2 years later, almost.
I mean, there's this story about Marco Rubio, who was supposed to meet with Mark McCandlish. I don't know if you're familiar with
I'm very
that
familiar
story.
with
And
Mark McCandlish.
he
Yep.
passed away, and before they were supposed to meet, and that allegedly scared Marco Rubio quite a lot. Have you
Well,
heard about that?
he didn't just pass away, Pop.
I know.
His
I'm
head
being
was
I'm
blown
being
up with a shotgun, and I
I'm
do not
being
believe
vague.
for a second that that was suicide. Not
Yeah,
for a second.
I'm being vague because there's often these sort of strawman kind of arguments against you know these types of events. I'm obviously also suspicious that he didn't just pass away. Do you think that that had any influence in Marco Rubio's eventual, um, you
I
know?
don't. I just don't know. I've got to. Those are three very powerful words in the English language. I don't know,
Yep.
and we need to hear more of that from our intelligence community. To just say I don't know if you don't know. But the problem is we pay them to know. We pay them
Yeah.
to get. So these folks, my heart. This is why my heart goes out to them. They want to say they don't know, but we pay them to know. So we stick them between. It's a nutcracker. We stick them
Yeah.
between a rock and a hard place from the get go. And so that's kind of a microcosm of the Department of Defense at large, because we pay the Department of Defense to protect us, and yet we got kids and adults, parents and their kids sometimes together, like Whitley is told about, being plucked out of the ocean like fish. I used to use a different analogy, but we're a 2/3 water world. So maybe fish is a better example of what the abduction phenomenon is like. It's catch and release. And so
Yeah.
here we are, arguably sentient beings, the dolphins getting caught in a tuna net. And we need to convey to them, look, don't fish us. You don't want to eat us, right? And so toss us back. So the worst way to do that is for us to attack our fellow humans.
Yeah.
And so, what I want to try to trigger, and many of us want to try to trigger, is this overview effect. Are you familiar with the overview effect?
No.
So most astronauts, I really don't like to say all or every or be absolute, but most astronauts have an epiphany when they get into orbit and they see just how thin the atmosphere
That's right.
is. And in addition to that, there's no boundaries, right? There's no borders on countries. And so it is a stunning, what John Mack would claim is an adjustment of your worldview. And so
Yep.
a lot of those folks, a lot of astronauts come back and they become environmental advocates. They become much less, I guess, militaristic in a lot of their perspectives. And so you see this. So, what I would love to see is the angry monkeys. I know Gary Nolan uses the term angry monkeys, but that's because he's so secure in his academic status, right? I'm a little insecure, so I got to try to pretend to use scientific words. So I use irate primates, right? So all these irate primates hanging out on the planet. If you take an NHI perspective to how we're behaving, the NHI are probably going to say, well, look, you don't deserve to be taken out of the net. You gotta show us that you're sentient beings, that you're the happy dolphins out there. And we're not doing a very good job of that. We continue every time somebody declares war on somebody else over trivial silliness,
Yeah.
it just sets us all back. So that was a long answer to a short question, but I do want to get back to Beatriz and Steve at some point.
Yes, sir.
Work that into the conversation.
We can get into it because she just released a letter to Arrow, Beatriz did, and she got a really interesting and positive response, I think. I guess my question there is talk about Beatriz's work more recently, how it was at SCU, but also what are your thoughts on how the perception of Arrow might be changing, or do you think it's the same thing as when Kirkpatrick was there? Because there's this hesitance, and then you see people like Beatrice reaching out and getting a good response. Seems encouraging, but I get where people are hesitant. Where do you stand on it?
Yeah. So, well, first of all, to sum up Beatrice's work and then her collaboration with Steve Bruehl. So Beatrice established with the Vasco project that there were these transient objects, star-like objects, between 1949, a data set of plates from Palomar Observatory between 1949 and 1957. And 57 is so important because that was when Sputnik was launched in October, the movie October Sky, October 1957. And for me personally, that was what created DARPA. That's why Eisenhower created DARPA, because he had all these military flag officers, admirals, and generals. And Eisenhower's like, wait a minute. And I'm convinced this is the way it happened. Eisenhower calls everybody to the Pentagon. What the hell are you guys doing? Right out loud. We are supposed to be the democratic free thinkers, and the evil Soviet Union, this tyrannical group of one-way thinking people, just kicked our butts. And they put a basketball in space. Okay, Army, what the hell? How did you get outfoxed? Oh, sir, we were focusing on the next tank round to penetrate the Soviet armor because we're worried about the Soviet armor. All right, Navy, what are you? Well, we were worried about making our subs quieter or whatever. Air Force, what's your problem? Well, we were focused on the MiG, competing with them and making faster airplanes. So nobody was paying attention to this new, arguably battle space in low Earth orbit. And so Eisenhower created DARPA to combat that myopia. But there's another factor that doesn't get discussed enough, in my opinion. That's ego. Every one of those general officers, from 4-star down to 1-star, those guys and gals were worried, well, guys at that time, were more worried about any impact that they could do on their watch, right? So your typical military tour of duty is about 3 years. So you're in command at some of these levels for about 3 years, maybe a year and a half, somewhere in between those. And so they were only investing in projects that could come to fruition while they were in office or while they were in that assignment. And so Congress adopts a similar attitude. Well, I'm just going to worry about stuff that's going to be within the next 4 years. And so there's an inherent egotistical myopia that runs through military research and weapons development. DARPA was specifically created to avoid that. And so the folks that end up at DARPA are supposed to take on high risk types of efforts. And that's why our budget was so high, to fight that myopia. And you've got to fight your own ego to realize, look, bro, that 130, my portfolio at its height was about 130 million bucks. And I had to reconcile that I'm never going to get credit for any of that. It's not going to happen on my watch because it's too high risk. It's going to take probably a decade or so, and I'll be long gone by the time that happens. So there's a certain personality type there. But in the conventional military R&D at the Air Force Research Lab, Army Research Lab, Naval Research Lab, Office of Naval Research, all those folks, they got to be myopic by nature because the taxpayer wants return on that investment, now, not
Yep.
2 decades from now. So that's why DARPA and Sputnik and Beatriz are all tied in.
Yep.
Now, enter Steve Bruehl. Now, Steve Bruehl was the first author on the nuclear component of this. So Beatriz and Steve got together. Steve is a professor of anesthesiology in Nashville at Vanderbilt University, where my grandfather Blitch, before he shipped off to the Pacific during World War II, that's where he got his MD. And so I know Vanderbilt fairly well. It's a fabulous university, very well established. And Steve kind of backslid into becoming a statistical expert because a lot of pain management, which is his real niche within anesthesia, as you might expect, demands that sort of thing. So anyway, Steve does the statistical analysis to bolster Beatriz's work. And the most important thing that just emerged here was they've been through the ringer and they've been very well defended. Some of the people, by being so open and sharing their data, people that were skeptical of them that were trying to shoot them down, now are allies. And it's a wonderful thing. That's what we ought to be doing as folks researching UAP, is open the kimono.
Yep.
And what you'll find is the people you think that are enemies. One of my favorite quotes from Abraham Lincoln was what he was doing. He was responding to a criticism from a woman who said, I can't believe I ever voted for you because you're not going after the South, this Confederacy, and trying to destroy them. You're being too friendly. Why are you making friends with these people? Why are you making friends with the Confederacy? We need to wipe them out. And he finally gets perturbed. And as I understand it, he looks at her and says, "Dear madam, my dear madam, if I transform my adversary into my friend, have I not destroyed my enemy?" And then so she's stunned and walks away. So all of this to say that that's what Beatriz Villarroel and Dr. Steve Bruehl have achieved. And one of the biggest impacts of that really blew me away. I was just talking to Steve a couple of days ago after he got back from SEU. And he said that in the sensitivity analysis was a real hidden smoking gun. And I recognized it right away. Are you familiar with sensitivity analysis? Do you know what I'm talking about?
No. Can you please explain?
Sure. When you do linear programming types of things, and it's pretty common now, throughout business, where you give the boss 3 or 4, maybe 5 courses of action. And what you do is you assign the criteria by which you evaluate those courses of action, typically represented as rows in a spreadsheet. And then you have the value you assign in the columns. And then you just sum all those up, and it ends up with a number. Higher may be better, or lower may be better. You establish that ahead of time. And whatever that number comes out is probably what the recommendation to the boss is for that course of action. So let's say course of action 3 is the best course of action. Well, now what you really need to do is develop a level of confidence with that recommendation. So now what you do, you go back and you say, okay, criteria 2, let's say it's route selection, right? So criteria 2 may be the number of miles, what the distance is for that route. And we do this all the time. Our phones do this now. In the very early days of map GPS route selection, there was no sensitivity analysis. It just said, this is the fastest route. But then if there was a 5-minute delay because of traffic, it didn't recommend an alternate route. It was just dumb. So the sensitivity analysis is, what if we change the criteria? What if it's no longer distance, but time? Or what if it's, let's say you're hauling a big tractor and you don't want to go along windy roads. right? So now you'll have, and it'll say fewer turns, right? It'll say this is 2 minutes slower, but it's fewer turns. So you might change your course of action based on that. So you're analyzing that course of action recommendation based on the lowest number and how sensitive it is to changing or adding a new criteria, which is another one. And so in the sensitivity analysis, Steve shared with the audience at SEU a stunning revelation, in my opinion. And that was that if they changed the sliding scale of the time frame of the data plates, where you had these stars suddenly appear and then disappear, if you slid that one day before or after the nuclear testing, of course, they went after the nuclear testing, right? Because after the test, you'd expect interested parties, whoever they are, these NHI, to show up. But then, to be honest with it, and this is what you got to do as a statistician or behavioral scientist, whoever, science dictates that you got to check before and after. And he checked before, and they were stunned, because by far the highest impact of the sensitivity analysis was the number of transients that showed up the night before the test. Which is mind-boggling. Wait, there's been no test. Why is this artificial star, or I shouldn't say artificial, but non-human launched entity appearing directly over where there's going to be a nuclear test?
You know what you reminded me of? There's this old lecture from John Keel, the author, where he discusses that throughout history, when there's like some kind of peril in the world, like war, economic peril, any kind, environmental disasters, stuff like that, there's always activity before and after, but there's more importantly before. And you just reminded me of that. It's like a scientific proof of what John Keel spoke about back in the 90s. That's crazy.
Yes. And so this, I'm ecstatic that you brought that up, Pavel, because this is an example of what we were just talking about, the invisible college, right?
Yeah.
The folks that, let's say they signed up right after 9/11, like a lot of people did. I'm going to go in the military, and then, I'm going to test high on scores or whatever. And naturally, especially if you have good linguistic skills or personal skills, you end up in intelligence, doing what Dave Grusch did, what Lue Elizondo did, what Karl Nell
Matthew
did,
Brown,
what Jerry Staten did. Yeah, all these folks. Okay, so now you're 20 years old. You're eligible to retire, and you've only been studying UAP for what, 10 years? And here's all this stuff from John Keel, from all these other folks, from Sergeant Major Robert O. Dean, a command sergeant major who read the assessment on staff duty officer duty in 1967. And you haven't seen any of that. You've been looking at the Nimitz. You've been looking at, because the Nimitz was 2004, right? So that's almost a quarter century. So this is a microcosm, Pavel, that, the arrogance of some of the folks in the intelligence community who have only been looking at stuff in the vault, and they are ignoring this vast body of literature that's out there, just because, like Pippa said, they're all crazy. And so you're ignoring this wealth of information that Kirk and Pippa obviously agree on, that we should not be ignoring. And so there's a critical factor there. So thank you for bringing that up. That put that puncture in it. So to wrap this up, Steve was the first author on that Nuclear Transient Association paper, not Beatriz, but Beatriz is way more famous, and it's good for her, right?
Yeah.
But that sensitivity analysis is mind blowing to me, because this brings in the consciousness aspect of it, right?
Yeah.
Somehow somebody's figuring out it's about to happen. Are they monitoring brainwaves somehow. I don't know, but it
Yeah,
is,
and
the data is there.
you inevitably think about like other more fringe theories, like the extraterrestrial model from Mike
Like
Masters,
Master, sure.
who I had on the show this year. I was very happy to talk to him about all of this.
It was a
That's
great
when
interview.
those
Great,
different
very well
theories.
done.
Thank you, sir. Thank you. I do want to talk about a little the other disconnect that I think there is when it comes to abductees, contactees, and because, for example, I had a near-death experience, and there is a level of, I can only call it contact because I can't describe it in any other way, that I've had ever since with different situations and moments in my life that I've gone like, how the hell did that happen? And it's just little nudges, little signs that ultimately I think have secured my well-being in many senses, like decisions that I would have made had I not been nudged in a certain way that would have probably destroyed my life, my career, stuff like that. And that's a different thing compared to somebody who was abducted or had contact like yourself, which is very much sort of ethereal, but also physical in many cases because there are implants and other types of physical and psychological effects that are lasting the entire life. I guess my question is, uh, how do you think we can bridge that gap of this disconnect that exists between people who have not gone through that and are trying to understand it uh, and trying to find proof that it is real? Because we hear a lot of these stories and they sound really out there. And I'm open minded, but not everybody is open minded like myself. There's a lot of people that reject this and that have a lot of preconceived notions of what might be. And they say it's entirely psychological and it's just hallucinations and all that. How do you think we can bridge that gap?
Oh, yeah. Well, so first of all, um, I'm not so sure there is a gap. I am not so sure that these are two separate and distinct um, activities. I think there's sort of a blend. It's sort of like the illusion of solid matter, right? So this cup
Yeah.
is comprised of atoms, and uh, those atoms are comprised of subatomic energy packets. And now we're it's pretty well established that there's really no solid matter. There's just forces there that prevent my finger going through this, but will allow subatomic particles to go through it. And so one of my favorite experiments when was done by a buddy of mine. It wasn't really an experiment; it was more of a demonstration. He was a chemistry teacher and a headmaster in a school in Alabama. Brilliant guy. So he takes his chemistry students out to a football field because that works in Alabama, right? It's wonderful. It's brilliant. So I'll go on, takes a golf ball, tennis ball. Here's the proton. Here's the neutron. Where do you think the electrons are? I don't know. 50-yard line, 20-yard line, zero, first row of seats, edge of the stadium. And so all the students are kind of guessing, and now it becomes a Price is Right sort of game, right? Uh, and so he responds with the first shell of the electrons is downtown, and the students' minds are blown away that, oh my God, this atom is nothing but space, right? And so we have this illusion that there's this solid thing. So this notion of a near-death experience and an interaction with at least some of these NHI may not be that different. Now, I wanted to circle back to Mike Masters, and I love his extratemporal hypothesis. It makes all the sense in the world when you look at the size of our eyes and how pronounced our jaws are. Because I had to chew on a bunch of meat this morning just to, or if I'm a vegetarian, I got to chew on some cud or asparagus. Just don't make me eat broccoli. That's a no-go zone. But in any case, he makes a very, very compelling argument, not just on the skeletal structure, but also the neurological structure of how visual we are. So the V1 area is back here, and a good chunk of our cognitive processing is visually oriented, right? And so the relationship between the size of the eyes and the size of the head and the jaw, especially if the other part of our brain that makes our head need to expand is this telepathic component, this consciousness component, it makes all the sense in the world that as we evolve, we end up with a big light bulb head like the big gray guys or like the little gray guys, right? Big head, skinny little neck, all that type of stuff. However, I disagree vehemently that explains all the experiences of all the many, many beings. Where's Richard's book? I got it in my bookshelf. Richard Dolan has a book called Alien Agendas, and he's got a page in there where there's 34 different descriptions of different beings, and some of them are wildly different, like the scarecrows from Pascagoula. I say that because the beings that Charlie Parker I'm blanking on the name. I got tip of the tongue syndrome. Anyway, they look like carrots sticking out for 2 ears and 1 nose, and then they had lobster claws. And then Carl Higdon, the 73 abduction, where, by the way, his lungs were miraculously healed. He had tuberculosis scars. And when David Paulides interviewed him, he showed him, and I think it's in his book, the side-by-side x-rays of his lungs before his lifelong x-rays throughout his life, and then after he was found, after his experience, which is fascinating, and no scars. How do you do that? We do not have the medical technology to do that. And yet there it is. So there is a physical manifestation of that event. My own 3 bruises, that was enough. That's weak corroborative evidence. It's nowhere near as strong as Terry Lovelace with his implants that he has in his body right now. So anyway, the physical representations are enough to convince me that there is a physical activity going on, but the anthropological, the extratemporal relationship, that all makes sense. Science supports that, because if you can bend space-time, I mean, this is how Einstein proved his relativity is with an eclipse, that the light moved in the shadow of that eclipse. And so he showed that something was bending. Well, if you can bend space, time goes with it. And we know that from relativity. So if you can bend space, you can bend time, you can skip dimensions. Because as that plane folds up, now you just go from here to here, right? And so there's all of that is intertwined. So I don't like the exclusivity of they're either time travelers or galactic travelers or interdimensional beings, all of the above. It's a big soup. When you look at how many different, and humans aren't the best example of this. The best example of this are canines. Look at the difference between a Chihuahua and a Bernese Mountain Dog or a Saint Bernard, right? I mean, look at the magnitude of the difference. And it's not just size; it's the shape of the head. It's the ability of a beagle to get down into a hole to hunt, and then as the rabbit comes out the other end, there's a Labrador Retriever that thinks it's a duck and latches. So there's a lot of variety in all that. And so I just I worry about egos, and I'm not saying Mike Masters, he's a wonderful guy, and he's probably the least egotistical.
And he's open to other theories as well. Yeah, he agrees with you. He agrees with
wonderful. You. I know he does. It's wonderful. And so that's what we need more of, instead of this divisive playground of it's my way or the highway. we need to have respectful disagreements. And
Yeah.
unfortunately, the ufology world we're allowing our egos to get in the way. And so
Yep.
anyway, that's my take on that. Have I closed all the tangents? My wife usually limits me to 5 tangents.
No,
She said,
yeah.
5 elliptic rings. Before you open up a new one, close one.
That's the idea on this type of podcast. I know that other podcasters or creators do like a prepared sort of question lining, but you're the guest. I mean, I like to let the guests just go on tangents. That's the fun part of it, I think.
Well, thank you
so
very
don't
much.
worry.
I really appreciate
Don't worry about it. Yeah. So I want to ask about this disconnect as well from the perspective of Jake Barber's experience, because when he came out, there was this obviously sort of disarming moment from him where he spoke about this experience that he had. And Whitley Strieber on Area 52 sort of alluded to it potentially being a manipulative tactic that some of the visitors sometimes use. And he said that. I was surprised to hear him say that. And I reached out to Jake to ask him about this, whether he knew for certain that he wasn't being disarmed on purpose to make him feel more docile to whatever interaction was going on. He doesn't feel like it was a negative thing at all, but he agreed that it could well be probable or possible. And this goes back to John Keel again, because John Keel has a very Fortean sort of perspective of what's going on. He thinks that not all of it is positive, that there is some negativity around it. I happen to think it's reflective, as you well put it earlier in this conversation. What do you think about that, though, about this interaction and the potential for the phenomenon to be multifaceted, but also deceiving of people, just to keep us docile? What do you think about that?
So I realized that I left one tangent unclosed, and it may relate to this with regards to near-death experience. But I'll leave that open for now if you'll allow me, and then I'll come back to it if you'd like.
Yeah. Yes, sir.
So I think what correct me if I'm wrong, but you're referring to Jake's very emotional response to this motherly influence that actually put a tear in his eye, right?
Yep.
And then, as I understand what you're saying, is Whitley mentioned that might be. He didn't say. Did he say definitively?
No. He said it might be. Yeah, it might be, and that's why I think it goes back to Keel, because Keel had a very dark vision of what this was, especially in his later years. And I just wonder if he might have, based on all the investigations that he did, he might have gone to that conclusion because of the overwhelmingly negative experiences that people have gone through, because there have been many, and more negative than positive. If you ask me, maybe we disagree on that, but yeah, that's what I meant.
Yeah. So it wasn't just John Keel. David Jacobs had a very negative perspective on this. As a matter of fact, one of his 5 or 6 books was called The Threat.
Yeah.
And he essentially was proposing an invasion of a different kind, a hybridization invasion, in which So I am not in agreement with those theories for a number of reasons. First and foremost, scientific extrapolation, we can't interpolate yet until we acknowledge and there's an open communication with NHI and humans appearing on the stage, all around the world, right? That sort of thing. So all we can do is extrapolate at this point, and extrapolation can be very dangerous. When we talked about statistics, right? So you draw these dots, and then you assign this trend line, and it goes way outside the collected space of your data. Well, yeah, that can be dangerous. It can lead to the wrong conclusions, but heuristically, it's the best thing you can do. You don't have that other data. You can't collect that other data. So extrapolating from humans, and I've said this many times, that 99% of violent crime is only committed by 1% of the human population. And this holds true across cultures, across languages, across geographies, throughout the human condition. So it makes sense to me that beings out there in other dimensions, other galaxies, even other time frames would hold up very similarly, right? So, however, it ain't zero. It is not zero.
Yeah.
We do have very well established scientific evidence. One example is John Brandenburg's assessment of radiological
Mars.
isotopes, right, on Mars.
Yeah.
Thorium and half-life of I'm drawing a blank. I'm a new guy, you know. Anyway, very compelling argument for that. You got Wachowski analysis of the Todd Seas case of human mutilations and animal mutilations. It's not zero. It's very small.
As well.
Say again.
Colares in Brazil as well in the 70s.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I've got to say that I think George Knapp and Jeremy Corbell did a great job reinvestigating that. And what they found, which was very compelling to me, was upon a second look, it didn't look like those folks were actually being attacked as much as being remotely sampled. So, they would get hit and there would be chunks of flesh moving off them, but it wasn't because they were trying to make them bleed. It was just trying to get, like we did with polar bears, for crying out loud. We would gather polar bear flesh, and sure, you're bleeding, so it looks like you're attacked, but we do that all the time with animals all over the planet. So I'm not as convinced that there was a malicious component in the Colares event as I am with the Todd Seas case, as well as the Grudge Report 13 about Jonathan Lovett and Holloman Air Force Base. So, and I don't really want to go much further down that path because we don't want to. I'm supposed to be a fear fighter. I'm trying to fight the fear, but in my mind, the best way to fight fear is not like this, not to ignore it and wish it away. I want to choke out fear like an MMA fighter.
I love that UFC analogy that you have because this is very, very evident. I'm a sports journalist, so I immediately connected to that. If you're in the UFC or in MMA and you go into the octagon, everybody's afraid. Like that's a default because you're gonna get hit in the face. Your neck could be broken, but
it's gonna hurt.
The key is to just be in control, be calm, and understand that whatever happens, you need to be calm because that's the only way that you can predict what might happen when you're on that flow state. So I really love that analogy from you.
Well, thank you, and it's quite relevant because embracing the crash retrieval process is part of that. You calm yourself by convincing yourself, okay, my adversary is bigger than me, but I'm a little quicker. And I might be able to get inside him with an uppercut or a chokehold because of this, that, or the other thing. And so you got to look for your niche opportunities. So this is why part of ripping the Band-Aid off is, yes, American citizens, yes, John Blitch, I am admitting to you that we could not protect you when you were getting taken as a kid and then again on your mountain bike and then again when you're in grad school. I want to admit that to you. But now we can kind of protect more because of this reverse engineering program. And now we kind of know how at least some of these craft work, and we can interfere with some of them. And so the abduction and crash retrieval thing goes hand in hand, because convincing yourself that you can succeed in that fight calms everybody down.
I have a question about that because you recently stated, or maybe it's different to what you stated, but I kind of caught that you said once that Lue and David Grusch had developed potential methods to stop abductions, and that's why they haven't been attacked, lethally. You also mentioned shutdowns. Can you elaborate a little more on that? Because I find that really interesting, and I just wanted to know if you have any insight on that.
Yeah. So again, this is belief, not knowledge. My belief is that the reason why Lue and Dave were able to survive as whistleblowers is that the governments around the world now can interfere with some of these kidnapping, abduction activities. And so we're on the verge of being able to admit, just like I would have to admit to my kids, look, there's a child molester at the end of the street. I've used this analogy many times. Stay away from them. But I really can't prevent, unless I'm a helicopter parent, that person may be doing something to my kids. Now we can't. Now we do have the technology to at least put up a fight, do something to let them know that we see what you're doing and we don't like it. Quit fishing for dolphins. You guys gotta change your net to get other fish. Leave us out of it, right? And so that's what I was implying, is that in the past, I do believe that there was some heinous activity used against whistleblowers because the government, this is the way the military mind works. I don't agree with it, but this is the way the military mind works. We're here to protect you, right? The cops, we're here to protect you. But yet you are guilty of shooting and killing innocent people because you're not at your best. You're not able to perform the mission that you claim that you can. And no government, no city, no country, no state can protect 100% of its citizens. So it's a losing proposition that you can protect everybody all the time. And that also abrogates responsibility on the individual, right? People want to sit back and say, well, I have no reason to protect myself. I don't have any reason to own a gun or whatever. And for the vast majority of the population on this planet, that is true. And I love it. That's what's great about living in the UK. That's what's great about living in Australia. But look what just happened in Australia in Bondi Beach, right? That massacre.
Yeah.
So nothing's perfect. And so there's holes. It's a Swiss cheese effect. But I want us to focus on the cheese, not the holes. Focus on the good tasting protein that's coming out of that cheese. There's going to be holes. And we just got to accept that and just be ready for it and do what we can to protect ourselves. And that's why sharing the knowledge that experiencers, the hard-won knowledge that abductees and experiencers have that can help us defend ourselves. There may be ways, there may be methods that we can use in our brains to defend ourselves from some of that. So all of that to go back to that open tangent about past life experience.
Yes, sir.
I personally had a direct, rigidly supported, empirically, objectively supported experience with communication with life after death. And it happened in December of 1988 when the Pan Am 103 flight out of Lockerbie was blown up. And I had a friend, a Green Beret by the name of Captain Joe Curry, that was on that flight. And when I was just at the disclosure forum the next day, no, it was actually the Saturday afterwards. That was on a Thursday. We went Saturday. Um, I visited two of my buddies at Arlington National Cemetery, and one of them was at the Lockerbie Memorial in Arlington National Cemetery. So I can elaborate that in more detail, but I now know from that experience that there is unquestionably life after death, and there is unquestionably, in my mind, communication with those that have passed over, and that helps me fight my own fear. Because even if I get kidnapped as soon as, or maybe you see him come in, somebody hauls me away, and they torture me till I'm dead, I know I'm coming back. I know there's another life after that, another life after that, and it helps me deal with failure too, because okay, it's fifth grade. I should know my timetables by now. I should know, column one of the periodic table. I don't. I'm coming back. All right. If you did something heinous during this lifetime, you're coming back. And guess what? You're probably going to come back as a victim of it. So you appreciate the magnitude of the damage that you did in that previous lifetime. So that helps the fear fighter aspect of things in my perspective. But I share that story and what comprised the corroboration that turns that from just a belief into knowledge, just like the bruises.
I don't know what happened to me specifically or where it comes from, but there were times when I avoided getting shot at for a little nudge of moving to a certain place, and somebody was killed right there just 2 minutes after. I avoided car crashes that were really, really wild ones just for moving to the right lane at the last moment, like 10 seconds after, it happened. So it's a complicated situation for people who go through this. It seems like some sort of traumatic experience helps people become more in contact with these experiences or entities or whatever you want to call them. I had a conversation with Chris Bledsoe about this on LinkedIn, where I told him, because I have concerns about the surroundings of him. There's a lot of people that seem to be taking his experience and telling their own narrative about what is happening. But I do know, and I feel like he's a good person. I don't think he has any nefarious sort of intent. And when I told him my experiences, I'm like, you have this interpretation of it because you're religious. You have a religious background, and I understand that. But this happened to me, and I don't know what that is. And he immediately went like, "Those are angels." I'm like, "How do you know that for sure?" And that's like my gripe with it. And I'm not like anti-spirituality or anything like that. I'm very spiritual. I'm just not keen on the religious sort of indoctrination that has happened in humanity for the last 2,000 years. Where do you stand on that, though? That sort of religious interpretation and spirituality in general, when things like this happen to people?
Yeah. So, well, I hear your rejection of dogma. Is
Yes.
that a fair
Yes.
summarization of what you're talking about?
Yeah.
And I share that with you. You can call them angels or demons or fairies or elves or whatever you want to label them, and all of those are in reference to NHI, in my opinion.
Yeah.
They're non-human intelligences. And so when you get into what to call them, jinn or whatever it happens to be, that's up to you. And I impose no rejection or support for any of that. However, I will tell you from a logical standpoint, and I make reference to this in my book, I had two very substantial trigger points when I was growing up as a kid. One was Santa Claus, and I talked to Ross about this, about how my dad was forcing me to participate in the Santa Claus conspiracy, because it wasn't just enough that I was calling him out for this BS explanation of this chubby white guy with a sack of toys. I was not good that year. And I forget what I got. I think I got a hockey stick for Christmas. I didn't deserve that hockey stick. I was a pain in my mom's butt all year round. So I didn't deserve it. And there is no freaking way that hockey stick we didn't even have a chimney. So what the hell? This is ridiculous.
That's funny.
And so he would tell me about John Glenn and how, he orbited 7 times, before coming down. And I'm like, and this guy on some magic sleigh, by the way, what happens with that sleigh in the desert? You just showed me in National Geographic the desert. And so this is ridiculous. So don't give me that crap. And then secondly was about a year later, I was an altar boy, and we had a horrible snowstorm, and I ended up being the only one to make it to Mass because my dad had a big 4-wheel drive Jeep that he wanted to show off that he could drive in the snow. So nobody else showed up. The main guy who carried the crucifix, down the aisle for the procession to start the Mass, he didn't show up. And so I was like, I don't know, 4'10" maybe. And everybody was joking afterward that it looked like the crucifix was levitating down the aisle because our rector was a Episcopal church. Our rector was this huge football player guy, big gentleman, wonderful guy. Anyway, because of that, I got to listen to the sermon. Usually I would have to go downstairs with everybody else to go to Sunday school, blah, blah, blah. And so I didn't. I had to stay after and clean the communion cups and do all that. So I suddenly realized as I was listening to the rector's sermon, and he's talking about how God is all about forgiveness. And that was his entire sermon was about forgiveness. And he was talking about how JC turned the other cheek. God, forgive them. They don't know what they're doing, right? Forgive them for I forget the terminology. So I suddenly realized, oh crap, I'm going to miss Sunday school. So I wipe everything down and run downstairs, and I catch the last 5 minutes of class. And the teacher's talking about the Great Flood and about how God wiped everybody out because of all the horror and thievery and Sodom and Gomorrah. And I'm like, wait a minute. The guy upstairs was just talking about how forgiveness is about everything. Why didn't God forgive everybody? And so I made the mistake being little Johnny in the corner, and I asked that question. And I said, Mrs. McGillicuddy, whoever it was, and she sees my hand kind of sheepishly go up, and she goes, yes, little Johnny. And this is probably a joke somewhere, I don't know. And I said, why didn't God just forgive everybody? And I got to tell you, Pavel, her mouth opened and closed 3 times. She was like a stunned mullet. She was like, and then 3 times. And then she never answered it. She said, okay, that's it for today. You guys have a great morning. Just be first in line to get the donuts and the coffee before your parents come down. And that was it. I never got an answer. And I still don't have an answer to this day, that you have these, as you've already pointed out, these disconnects, these conflicts, these logical conflicts with the way this goes. So for me, back to that overview effect, I can imagine a superior intelligence, however you want to call it. Is it angels? Is it however you want to call it, looking at the irate primates and trying to help them? Okay, you guys got to quit. Look, you got to quit killing each other. Can we agree that should be commandment number 1? Yeah, all right, that makes sense. All right. And can we agree that we shouldn't be stealing from each other? Because that's why your village is trying to kill these guys to get their corn because you think they stole your corn, whatever. Yeah, that makes sense. So you get down these, but then there are the ones that really don't make a lot of sense from a science standpoint. One of those that don't make sense is adultery. Because if you're going to propagate the species, variety makes sense. You want to hook up and create as many different kinds of babies to survive the next pandemic, to survive the next this or that or the other thing. So now it's starting to sound like a genetic experiment. We don't want you mixing between, right? And we want you to stay this way because we want to see how your reproductive system carries on. So the way science works with us, I remember sitting at Caltech at a transhumanism conference, I don't know, 15 years ago. And they were talking about the number of iterations of fruit flies to carry through a genetic trait that they were tampering with. They were manipulating. We do this manipulation that they mentioned. Now I'm closing that tangent, hopefully. Finally getting back to that tangent, closing that one down. But yeah, there's manipulation. I have manipulated human participants in my studies. Sometimes you have to be deceptive. I talk about this with regards to Jane Goodall. You know, she was a wonderful, brilliant scientist, wonderful human being, but her, from a behavioral science standpoint, absolutely flawed. You can't draw any conclusions about those primates that you were dealing with because you were tampering with their behavior by being in there. You got to use a duck blind. You got it. This is Heisenberg principle. This is the Hawthorne principle in psychology that you have to hide if you're studying behavior and you're going to come to a scientific conclusion about that behavior because it's not natural behavior. And I challenge, I've used this many times, anytime you bring this brain into a clinic to participate in a study, not the same brain. It's not the same brain that drove back and forth to work. It's not the same brain that went down to pick up your kids. Your brain changes when you go into any hospital. Your brain changes when it goes into any clinic because now you know people are looking at you. Not to mention that you probably feel bad because you wouldn't be in a hospital you wouldn't be in that clinic in the first place if you didn't have something wrong with you. So all of that to say that manipulations occur in science. They have to. That's how that's how medicine progresses. So just because there's manipulations, getting back to Whitley and Jake Barber, which was what, 20 minutes ago? Takes me a while to close them, but eventually I'll get back to them. That's why manipulation isn't necessarily malevolent. It isn't necessarily evil. Sometimes it's just science. And it's
You know what icked me about Jake? There's this interview he did with an Italian channel where he expresses that he wants to serve the phenomenon. And that was a strange kind of phrasing that I found. I was like, what do you mean serve the phenomenon? And did you listen to that interview? Did you see him say that? Because that was a strange kind of response from him. And that plays into a lot of what I think Whitley tried to convey there. What do you think of that?
Yeah, so this is wonderful. I'm really glad that you asked this question because it's something that I think Whitley struggles with because I don't think Whitley has ever served in the military. I don't know if you have, and I'm going to have a conversation with Jesse Michaels here coming up here in a little while about this because it's difficult for the civilian world to understand how the military mind works. So the vast majority of us, I have a chapter on this called The Military Mind, or a section of the chapter. The vast majority of us want to help others. We're not steely-eyed baby killers. I know Vietnam stories and Oliver Stone and a lot of these dramatic uh, representations of military service sort of show how we can be manipulated into becoming almost robotic killers because of the conditioning and so forth, just like operant conditioning, like Pavlov's dogs. And it's sort of a necessary evil of military service if you're going to be agile and very quick at defending. But it's a defensive situation. Now, when politics get involved and we're suddenly halfway around the world claiming that we're defending this country, now we're starting to have trouble. And that's what all the hue and cry of the anti-Vietnam War factor was. And it's alive and well right now, clearly, with Iran. They didn't attack us. Wait, they want a nuclear weapon? Well, wait a minute. So there are problems with that. But it's important for civilians to realize that that is the internal motivation. It wasn't just drilled into us in basic training and brainwashing year after year after year. It is part of what makes us us. We want to serve others. We want to help others. The vast majority of us were jocks and jockettes in high school, whatever, and we wanted to be part of something bigger than us. And so I am not surprised at all that Jake would make that statement. That is very consistent with the military mind, and it is very consistent with Jake's entire career field, where he was, sheep dipped and went into a covert assignment to gather intel, to gather foreign material. I mean, we used to collect crashed MiGs and radar systems throughout the Cold War. It makes all the sense in the world that there would be something else mixed in with that. It's kind of like the dolphin and the fishnet. Ooh, this doesn't look like the other fish. This doesn't look like a MiG, right? And so I'm not surprised about that at all. But the military mind is different than the way we're represented. It's, a lot of the civilian world looks at us like Colonel Jessup in A Few Good Men. You can't handle the truth. In fact, I've got a section in a chapter about that with Jack Nicholson's face, and that was a great movie, wonderful movie, and it did a good job of capturing that 1%, because that character was the 1%. That was a psychotic, non-normal human being who happened to end up in a command position. And that's the problem with this 1%, 99%. It makes you feel really good, but if that 1% is in charge, now you end up with Hitler.
This is the follow-up to a good follow-up to ask about this, because there's a lot of debate over whether there's one legacy program or multiple legacy programs. Do you think that they're managed mostly, and that's where the secrecy comes from by these 1%ers?
Yeah,
Yeah,
I do, and I also believe the first thing you said, that there are multiple programs. This is compartment. This is kind of like Hydra. I hate to use that negative overview, because I do think that the vast majority of people that are serving in those programs are well-intentioned. And I believe, again, it's belief, not knowledge, because I've never been read in on any of that stuff.
Do you know any that claim to be in those programs by any chance? Just yes or no? No need to go into specifics.
Oh, yeah.
Yes? Yeah. Oh, okay.
Yeah. But that's secondhand. That's not me being in it.
Yeah.
That's somebody telling me they've been in it. So that's why I've got to say it's a belief. It's not direct knowledge, because I don't have the direct perspective in it. So I have received quite a bit of independent corroboration from the Venn diagram between the open literature ufology library, like, these guys,
Yep.
right?
Yep.
By the way, I wanted to point this out. Now, I haven't had the opportunity to do it yet. That a Nobel laureate, here's the chapter in Bill Chalker's book, chapter 6. The Nobel laureate was an abductee, Dr. Carey Mullis,
Oh.
from his cabin in Anderson Valley in Mendocino County. He was the guy that developed the PCR test for DNA. So that is not well known, not well realized. But so there's tidbits like that the world needs to know, and that the guys that grew up in these compartments don't know. They don't understand that. And it's got the classic screen memory of, I think he described it as a beaver or badger or a woodchuck or something, or maybe a leprechaun or whatever it is. Typical screen memories type of thing. A lot of times they're owls. For me, it was, the impossibly big ant guys, whatever. Anyway, so the compartmentation of this is the corrosive element that I am blowing the whistle on. And this is how Terry Lovelace is triply traumatized, because not only are he and Toby, Sergeant Tobias is what he calls him in the book, his second book, he comes clean and acknowledges that Toby's real name was Rodney. Anyway, they were separated, and just like Mario Woods and Michael Johnson were separated, this is a horrific, corrosive form of leadership, and I'm putting that in air quotes for a reason, because that ain't leadership. That is corrosive mismanagement and corruption that is injected into a command climate, and that is how these sorts of things happen. So yes, I have no doubt that there was that mentality. The 1% has corroded, has injected that poison into these programs. And what's so horrific about it is that it turns us from a potentially collaborative team into an aggregate team. So do you know what I mean by that? The aggregate versus collaborative?
Not exactly, no.
I talk a lot about it in human-robot interaction, because my claim is that the vast majority of human-robot interaction is not collaborative. It is aggregate. So when I talk about collaborative teaming, I'm talking about, let's use sports analogy, a track team, a boxing team,
Basketball.
a swim team. Say that again?
Basketball.
No. Basketball is not an aggregate team. Track, boxing, wrestling, swimming, in all of those, if you're not in the pool, on the track, at the time that race is being run, you're a cheerleader.
Yeah,
there is no interaction between you and your quote teammates. You're not even really teammates. You're cheering for each other. That's it. Gymnastics. I could go on and on. So these are individual competitions that are artificially thrown together by a rating system, and that rating system is typical across the world. 5 points for first place, 3 points for second place, 1 point for third place. So third place plus second place, you're still less than first place.
Yep.
Right? So that's an aggregate formation. And I'm not saying it's a bad thing, it's a good thing. And you can bolster each other, you can support each other during training and so forth, but that's nowhere near what it's like to be on a basketball team, on a soccer team. Look at FIFA, right? You got 7 people that touch that ball before it goes in the goal. And the final person that touches it, who knows? It happens to be, now, you try to shape it, like get the ball to Pavel. because
To the striker. Yeah.
yeah, you get it to the striker, especially if you're lefty and they're weak on that side of the field. Then yeah, so maybe a couple of folks will have more goals and everything, but typically it's not about the individual. It's about the ball or the hockey puck or whatever it happens to be to get into the goal. And multiple people are responsible for that. And it's also about compensating for weakness with strength. So in baseball, for example, first baseman almost always is a lefty because you've got, and it's a tall lefty, because you got the glove on your right hand, which gives you a better reach, and you can get to that ball a millisecond or two faster, and that runner's going to be out instead of a righty with short arms like me, my little Tyrannosaur arms, and I get the ball a half a second late, right? So, but because my legs, maybe I can be a little quicker. I can shag the balls out in left field better than the tall, lanky, lefty. So it's compensation for weakness and strength. And so collaboration is where we need to be. And what I worry about is this corrosive stovepiping compartmentation means that we're pursuing UAP research in an aggregate fashion. And a wonderful example of collaborative opponent to that, or an alternative to that, is Beatriz and Steve Bruehl. Now, certainly Steve Bruehl has had physics classes, maybe looked up at the stars, but he doesn't know astronomy like Beatriz does. And Beatriz certainly has had statistics classes and so forth, but she doesn't know the stats of behavior and pain like Steve Bruehl. So that collaboration is magical. And look what just came out of that. This phenomenal result of sensitivity analysis, finding out that a very strong statistically significant number of those transients occurred the night before the detonation of the nuclear test. And that is another mind-blowing result that is moving the needle into the awareness that, look, we are not alone in the cosmos. We're not alone temporally, per Mike Masters' point. We're not alone dimensionally, and we're not alone, physically, geospatially.
Yep.
So that's my best answer for that one.
Okay. I have one last question where we're going to stay on the 1%ers and your expertise in robotics, because there's 6 CEOs of companies of AI that are currently constantly going to meetings with government agencies and trying to determine whether they pull the plug or not. There's a lot of fear that I think might be misinformed about that. For me, one of the biggest concerns when it comes to UFOs is that some of these tech companies, CEOs like Elon and also potentially Peter Thiel, they act conspicuously about the topic as if they didn't know anything. And but there's stuff happening in the background, information that goes around about their interest that is not public. And when it comes to that relationship between a robot and a human, where do you stand on how advanced and how accelerated the AI is becoming, especially over the last couple of months? It's crazy. Yeah. And do you have the same concerns about Elon and Peter also? I wanted to ask you that.
Sure. I have enormous concerns. And early on, 3 years ago, before Jake came out of my boat, I was originally going to launch both books on separate websites because I didn't want my career in rescue robotics to overlap with potentially my career in UAP research. I wanted to keep them separate and distinct to avoid that,
yeah.
Right? And then I made a conscious decision to put them both on the same website. George Berengos set that up for me. What a wonderful editor, brilliant guy, literary services, and I'll continue to recommend people to go to him for self-publishing books and so forth. But that is over this issue, which is my biggest concern about AI is that it is insulating us. It has the potential to insulate us from accountability on both positive and negative. So if a machine is deciding who to kill and who to spare, then that absolves the human from that decision. And that is the vortex that Terminator talks about, all these movies and books. And I mean, every time somebody wants to take the restrictions off of AI and just let it go, I'm like, dude, have you not seen Terminator? What is wrong with you? How do you not understand? And a lot of my buddies, not a lot, but several of them call it my John Connor complex, right? That I think I'm trying to save the world from AI. But there is a component to that because accountability is key to learning. I've talked many times about how mistakes are a great way to learn because mistake-ridden memories are durable. We will remember our mistakes much longer than our successes. Now, there's exceptions, right? The first time I scored a goal, I'm going to remember that the rest of my life. And every now and then, David Goggins. You familiar with David Goggins?
Of course I am.
Yeah. A lot of people know him. So he talks about the cookie jar.
Yeah.
And I have dipped into that cookie jar on occasion when I'm in my lowest points. When I'm laying, I think I'm going to lose my leg. I'm in the hospital. And I dip into the cookie jar every now and then, and I think back to when my lacrosse team carried me off the field after scoring a goal, the game-winning goal, and like triple overtime. It was hot as hell. They had to stop the game because I was getting muscle cramps, and I scored a goal, and they carried me off the field. That is one of the most compelling events in my entire life. So when I'm at my lowest point, I pull that out of the cookie jar and I get a little sweet with it. So, but the vast majority of things that keep me up at night are the mistakes that I've made. And so if we start to offload responsibility for those mistakes to a machine, we are in trouble because it starts to influence our learning. And I'm not talking about classroom learning. I'm talking about, one of my other favorite quotes in addition to Abe Lincoln is Mark Twain. Don't let your schooling interfere with your education. In other words, go ahead and do your times tables, whatever takes you inside the schoolhouse, but get your butt down to the creek with Huckleberry Finn and learn life's lessons,
Yep.
And so that's a big concern for me is the lack of accountability. But it's not just insulation of accountability for mistakes and harm that you're causing other people. On the other side of it, in the rescue robotics world, there are those who want to just turn over firefighting and rescue to robots, and I am vehemently against that. And I have enemies. I hate to use that term, but I have people that attack me within the robotics community because they think I'm anti-robot. No, not at all. All I'm saying is that the firefighter, whoever is driving that robot around, who's ever manipulating that robot, controlling that robot, and by controlling, I'm not talking about clicking on a GPS coordinate and you're controlling the robot by sending it over to that waypoint. That's not control, not in my mind. I'm talking about manipulating a gripper and wrapping around somebody or delivering, in a confined space, a hose that they can drink from while the debris is being lifted around them. So my point is that firefighters and EMTs get the joy of living, the raison d'etre, the reason why they exist is to accept risk on behalf of their fellow humans. In fact, I claim that is love. That is the
It
expression
is.
of love.
My parents
And
are doctors. It is.
that's the way I feel about it. And so I'm glad you agree. So if we have the robot accepting all the risk, we're taking love out of the human condition. And that's a problem. I'm not saying that robots shouldn't accept some of the risk. I think they should, for sure. And I'm not saying that humans should just go accepting risk just to do it. But in some situations, a cold mechanical hand is not the way to try to calm a victim down when they're trapped under the rubble, like in Oklahoma City, and everybody has to move off the pile while Dana Bradley's leg was amputated. If you go look back and look, there were two surgeons, very heroic guys, who were in the process of amputating her leg, and then the klaxon blew, and we all had to pull off the pile because there was a thunderstorm, and the hygroscopic material on the roof had collected too much water, and it looked like the whole building was going to come down. So you didn't want to trade one victim for 100 and have 100 firefighters die in the process. So they had to leave them there. And I got to tell you, they had to be dragged off that pile. And that is the good side of humanitarian. That's where humanitarian comes from. Willing to accept risk for your fellow humans. So if you inject a robot in there, that is not doing humanity good. And if you inject a robot in between a human who's making a very challenging decision to take another human life, if you get a human in that, or if you get a robot in that instead of the human's not going to learn the life lesson of under what conditions you should be taking another life, like it's the last.
That's already happening with drone striking, right?
It is, and I'm very worried about that. Very, very worried about that. But in the Ukraine, I'm a strong proponent for FPV, first person view drone strikes, because those folks are making the conscious decision, and they see the impact of what they're doing. So that and they, I'm here to claim, they are going to be traumatized later in their life.
I think that this already happened. Dylan Borland spoke about this in the Weaponized interview about the psychological effects of that. He was part of that drone program, and you can see that he's been struggling because of that, because of those decisions. The last part of the question I would like to ask you about Elon and Peter, and we can add some Altman and Palmer Luckey, these guys that, if the legacy program does exist and the technology is real, why wouldn't they want to get their hands on them? And why wouldn't they want to be secretive about it, right? So what's your take on that, though? Because it sort of seems like the whole AI revolution that is upon us is walking hand in hand by the side of these guys. And I just think it's pretty unfair that they're not being upfront about their real intentions, it seems. What's your take there?
Well, I don't know any of those gentlemen. I've never met them, so I have a hard time, making comments about them in particular. That being said, the rationalization that I offer in the Abduction Amnesty Not is that the abduction activity that have been carried out by some NHI. I'm going to open another tangent and close it very quickly, because I agree with a lot of Stephen Greer's narrative. I don't agree with some of his personal behavior and some of the condescending ways in which he tries to send the message. But I think it's very important to separate the message from the messenger. I don't care
Yeah.
for the messenger, but a lot of that message makes a lot of sense. But the one thing that I haul BS up on all the time, and I will continue to do it, is his claim that all abductions are done by humans.
Yeah.
And
He said that.
He said that time and time again, and I think that's, we could discuss that some other time. But
yeah,
all of that to circle, so that tangent is now closed. But what's relevant about it is that I do think that evidence of the abduction phenomenon is what helps the 1% rationalize to use AI and take the restrictions off, because look, we are dealing with a vastly superior level of technology. And if our AI, if we can get inside their do loop or their OODA loop, you familiar with the OODA loop? Observe. So it's a process by which military decision making and cognitive science overlap. So if we can use AI to speed up the targeting process and launch on an adversary before they can respond, then we might get an advantage. So AI might allow us to intervene in the abduction phenomenon. And so I think behind closed doors, if you get somebody that's very influential or has an advanced technology that might be able to support the legacy program, I think they use the abduction phenomenon and evidence, videographic evidence that it's occurring. You see a body in like a blue beam, or you see wreckage with human body parts mixed in with non-human body parts. That, I believe, that is shown to those who want no part of this. And once they see that, then they realize, oh my God, humanity is screwed. So then they use that as a mechanism to rationalize taking the gloves off of AI. And that's where this overlap between my AI robotics work and the UAP abduction work really merges. And it is those gear teeth are really getting tight. And so the folks that you mentioned as the proponents of essentially unrestricted AI for weapon systems, I think that's how it's rationalized. And I vehemently disagree with it.
Yeah.
Because again, if you look at this overview effect and you see these irate primates playing with nuclear matchsticks, that's another one of my chapters, titles. And in addition to nuclear matchsticks,
AI.
now they got dynamite.
Yeah.
They got AI and nukes. And let's not forget, that was the original Terminator preface, was that AI got access to nuclear launch codes. And so there is ample evidence in the open literature that there has been intervention and is growing intervention from NHI in both of those areas. The nuclear stuff has been established, especially with Steve and Beatriz just this year. And I suspect that there's going to be evidence of intervention in AI development coming along as well.
That's wild.
Well, again, that helps me fight the fear.
Yeah.
That helps me sleep at night. That's the best way I can connect the dots.
Yeah. Thank you for your response and for your time, Doctor. I'm very happy that you took the time to speak to the audience. And I want to ask you, what are the books that people might want to take a look at that you've written and where can they find your work?
Okay, well, so the one that came out last year was this one, the Killer Rescue Robot Not. And that, basically the premise of that is what I just described to you, which is beware of AI. So I talk about my transition from designing robots for military purposes and staying away from the weapon side of it. So the most relevant chapter about that is what I call bromancing the brimstone. And it speaks to why, I don't know if you can see that, passing the nuclear buck and so forth and so on. Anyway, that's what this book is about. And the sequel to that starts with me getting called while I'm on the rubble pile on 9/11, about 10, 15 days later, and DARPA wants me to go to Tora Bora to use robots to try to find bin Laden in the caves. And that's where the second book starts. Then the title of that, I have established the title for that, which is The Greedy Rescue Robot Not, which is how do you come to grips with the greed associated with, basically trading your soul for money in terms of the morality of robotic technologies. And that's where some of this overlap with the guys that you just mentioned comes in. And then the other one that Ross mentioned, a year and a half ago, and I still am trying to pound the manuscript into submission, because part of the problem is that this is a rapidly evolving situation. Thanks to guys like you and your reporting, the goalpost is shifting. And so I have finally, as of the disclosure forum, I'm cutting that manuscript off. That is the last chapter of the manuscript. I might have an epilogue that's related to Mario Woods and his separation from Michael Johnson, but I don't want to talk about that. There's something that's coming along those lines, and I'll just leave it at that. So I want to thank you, and I want to thank anybody who has visited my website, which is fearfighter.org, and it has both books listed on there, a synopsis of both of them. But what's more important is there's a repository of video of robots in action at Nellis Air Force Base, Area 76 and 77, which turned out to be right near Area 51. And I used to drive through Area 51 to get to some of these other areas. And I'll just leave that hanging for a little bit because that gets to be sensitive, of course. So there is an overlap in these subjects, but there's a lot of video in there, especially for roboticists who don't give a hoot about NHI. There's a lot of video with robots doing what I consider to be really interesting things. And that's one of the critical aspects of robotics is a still picture doesn't cut it, because you can pose anything in a snapshot and make claims about it. But once you see it moving and behaving, this is where things get really interesting. So that's what's valuable about that website is the pictures. Let me show you one of the pictures in here has a QR code that so here's one of the pictures of a special operations demonstration that we did. See that QR code?
Yep.
If you scan that with your phone, that'll take you to the video clips of each one of these pictures. So you'll see Goldie in action, moving around downrange at Nellis Air Force Base. You'll see this guy. This is one of AeroVironment's, one of the original micro UAV drones, was smaller than a Frisbee that AeroVironment put together. And so if you want to tie that into Ukraine, which the second book will do, you've got the video showing the activity as opposed to just a still image. So all of those are loaded up on that website, along with me flapping my gums about UAP and so forth. So we'll see. And if I get some of my data back, if I can find that missing video of those bruises, and I can find the brain scan of a cyst on my pineal gland, all of that. I will post those on that website in
Awesome.
addition to the book. So
I'm going to leave it in the description so people can check it out.
sure.
Just before we leave, I would like to have you on by the end of the year because I'm going to ask you this question. Where do you see the movement by the end of the year? Do you think we're going to get some kind of confirmation already from the government, or do you not have too much faith on that right now?
So one personal thing before the end of the year is the 25th, and this is the wrong term to use, because an anniversary is supposed to be something happy, like your wedding or something of that nature. But this will be 25 years since 9/11 coming up.
Yeah.
And I have an audiobook version of this that's going to drop on 9/11, and we'll talk about that. There's a little teaser about the overlap between 9/11 and the crash retrieval program. And what I claim is that there is cross funding.
Oh.
Well, I call it connecting 911 dots. That'll be something
Whoa.
that's by the end of the year. I think that will come forward. But with regards to the UAP subject itself, I believe that the experiencer and crash retrieval subject is gonna be extremely important in 2027. And I think that's the last layer of the onion to come out. I think the crash retrieval part will come out first because it's not as scary. The fact that we're able to shoot some of these things down, that should make people feel good, right? But I think the last thing that the government is willing to do is to say, we couldn't protect you.
Yeah.
The crash retrieval is evidence that we can protect at least some of them.
I mean, assuming they're hostile, all of them, which I don't think, some of them may have been shut down not being hostile, I think. So that leaves a little...
I think the vast majority of them that have been shot down were not hostile.
Yeah.
They're scientists, they're biologists collecting data. It's just, it's, if you had some of the irate primates that, were being studied and they developed bows and arrows, this is another analogy I used a lot as to how can, people pose this. It's kind of the ridiculous Fermi paradox situation. Fermi paradox is probably one of the most arrogant statements ever to be made, right?
Yeah.
It assumes that we're worthy of being contacted, right? Would I land in the middle of a bunch of irate primates with nuclear weapons? Hell no. Yeah. And it assumes that they want to be seen. I just gave you a case where science demands that you're not seen. If you're going to study, you need to be covert about it. So you can back off on that logic to say that when they're seen, they want to be seen. Maybe they are trying to influence us. Certainly that's the case with the nukes. Yeah. They are actively, with their actions, showing you kids, you don't know what you're dealing with, and we're not going to let you do it. It is the adult with the fire hose, or not the fire hose. It's the adult with the garden hose in the backyard, and the kids, as soon as you light the matches and you put that, you're spraying the freaking water on those kids because you're going to burn the rest of the neighborhood down. So that's clear to me, and that's a consistent theme throughout Robert Hastings' work, and a lot of us have gotten together, Bob Jacobs, a lot of us, Bob Salas, Mario, Jeff, Terry, we've all kind of converged on that flavor. And again, there may be a garden hose sprayed on AI coming up soon. We'll see how that goes. Anyway, in addition to the Fermi paradox aspect of things, this notion that just because something enters our airspace, it's hostile, that is another ridiculous, arrogant statement to be made that we own this airspace directly over our country. First of all, again, overview effect. There ain't no borders from out here. Where's these boundaries on this map are absolutely artificial. And you guys, you Chinese and Americans and Russians, you can't even, go a year without shooting at each other. And you want us to be friendly to you? So
Yeah.
it is a irrational approach to shoot everything down. And I think Ryan Graves, another one of my heroes, because he has constantly reinforced this, that the only real threat of airspace management is the way we respond to it. If you have two jets that a UAP comes right between, they split, and then they crash into their own jets, well, yeah, that's a threat. But it's not the UAP, it's our reaction to it. And he's reiterated that time and time again. So I think the world really needs to pay more attention to Ryan Graves in that particular aspect of things. So I think probably the crash retrieval is going to come first, because then the government doesn't have to admit failure. It is admitting, look, we're trying to help you, and we're making some progress. And then the last part is the abduction phenomenon. That is the very core, the inner circle of the onion is what we use a lot of times to describe it. And that is the core of the entire secrecy program, because we're trying to keep the kids calm. We're trying to prevent them from thinking that as soon as they, at 18, and they go off to college, or they go off to a summer job, or launch a new career, or open a restaurant, or whatever they're going to do, that they're going to be raped. And the fact of the matter is, there is a percentage of kids that leave the household at 18 years, they're suddenly adults, and they're going to get raped. Male and female. I have very close friends who have had their sons raped. And it happens. And so that very uncomfortable fact is the last thing that the government's going to come clean with. But it lets them off the hook, in my opinion. That's a real paradox. If you can admit that some of us have been raped after we left the house at 18 years old, some of us have been abducted, and you were powerless to stop it, okay, that's the first step to me granting you amnesty. Because now that is a secret that is so disturbing that maybe we didn't want to know about it. But now it's in our face. And now we are the 18-year-olds as society that are like, all right, I got you. I'll take my chances. You need to share enough information with me so I can protect myself. And maybe I'll be willing to give up even more of my taxpayer money now that I know that that's going on. So that's why it's a paradox. It lets them off the hook, and it probably would end up with us being more accepting of a $13 gazillion trillion defense program. But we got to fight it. We got to fight the fear and recognize that we don't want to shoot first and ask questions later.
And we need the truth.
We need the absolute truth. You're absolutely right. I said this at our ASIS meeting last year, I think, that our politicians absolutely need to be held way more accountable for telling mistruths to the same level at service academies. I turned myself in for an honor violation as a plebe at West Point. One of the most traumatic things that ever happened to me. And we need that same level of scrutiny. And I launched that talk with the claim, jail time for lies. You lie, you're going to jail. Mandatory. At least one night. And I don't care what the magnitude of and then the number of nights in jail depends on the magnitude of the deception or whatever. But you lie, you're going to jail. I think we need to adopt that across society, across the globe. We
Yeah.
got to do something about this, because this constant deception is tearing us apart as a society, and it's dividing us more
Yep.
and it's defeating any cohesive, collaborative, and it poisons science. It prevents us from doing good science.
It dogmatizes it too.
Say again?
It dogmatizes it, science as well.
Yeah, absolutely. It is the antithesis of science. Science is based on collaboration and peer review. How can you peer review something if it's all compartmented and hidden? The first step in any good scientific project is a literature review of all the previous work that's been done. And now we know that we ain't getting access to that literature. So our science is crap. Our science is crap because it's been hidden from us. So I could go on and on. Thank you so much for letting me vent.
I appreciate you, Dr. Blitch, and thank you for your openness and for being always looking after the more ostracized people in ufology, which are experiencers and abductees. And I want to thank you for everything you do on this. And let's see if by the end of the year, let's have another conversation and see where we're at. Is that okay with you?
Yeah, absolutely. I would declare 2027 is the year of the experiencer. Optimistic.
Let's hope so. Let's hope so. Yeah.
And thank you for all you do to give everybody a voice. It really, really is important, Pablo. It's fabulous.
I appreciate you. Guys, you know what to do. Go visit Dr. John Blitch's website. I'm going to leave it in the description. And remember to stay curious and inquisitive like Dr. John Blitch over here. Always.
And
bye,
like
good
you.
doctor.
Okay.
Take care,
Have a
sir.
good one. Thanks, Pablo.
Bye. Always.